Jill Mannett. You have just completed an activity about the logic model. You have organized content from an actual logic model into its appropriate parts. I'd like to process that experience with you and go over a few important pieces. First, I want you to think about if it was easier or harder than you originally thought when you started this activity. A lot of us go into developing logic models thinking that it's going to be an easy task, but then we often find it was a lot harder than we had originally thought. And then, was it a little tedious? I think you had over 70 items that you clicked on to organize into the correct spots. And this can get a little annoying, to be quite truthful. It's easy to start thinking, oh, I just want to get finished. There's really one more piece, there's more items in this logic model. And this is actually a reality of creating logic models, is that people often go into them very excited about what they're going to do. And then a little ways into the process, they start to get a little annoyed and feeling like it's a tedious process. It's that process of going through all of those if-then statements that can create a lot of detail. And this is actually a pitfall of creating logic models. And if you're a social worker facilitating a group through this process, it's actually a point in time where you can start to lose your key stakeholders in the process because the detail can be too much. So you have to find a way to find some balance where you're not getting bogged down in so much detail that it's stifling the process, but that you have enough detail to still be able to map out what you hope to do with your activities and what you think that's going to result in. And then finally, with so many items, it's easy to get a little bogged down and confused about which item goes where in the logic model. That sometimes when you start to read these items, they look like they could be one and the same. And these nuanced differences can be confusing sometimes. So, how did you handle that? Did you have a process to double check, or did you just keep clicking until you were able to get the right answer? We'll get back to that at the end of this presentation. So here is a first glance at the completed logic model. These are the items that you just finished organizing into the appropriate spots. So this gives you a good idea of what it looks like when it's actually in the graphical form. You can see over on the left-hand side with the yellow column, that's the inputs. So those are all of the items that are needed to make the program operational. The two columns with the green box is the outputs. In this case, it's organized by activities and participants. And so these are all of the things that the program does and with whom. And then finally, the four columns on the right-hand side are the outcomes, and they're organized from short all the way to long-term outcomes. So this, you can see, has all of that detail in it, including some additional arrows and other items that help organize the material. I would like to point out a few pieces related to this logic model. First, this is an early draft of that same logic model. So as you can see, it's drastically different than the final product. And I'm showing you this because it's important to know that the first draft is never good. And that's why it's so important that when you do your own logic models, that you give yourself plenty of time to walk away in between drafts and come back and run them by people and double check them. Because again, that tediousness or those nuanced differences make for a terrible first draft. And so it's important that you get things down on paper and then start to think about them. And so just to point out a couple things with this first draft, essentially there were some things that worked well and some things that didn't. So over on the far right-hand side, in the long-term column, in child welfare, which is the focus of this particular logic model, there's three outcomes that are established nationwide. It's safety, permanency, and well-being. So strength of this particular logic model is that they do acknowledge those outcomes in their long-term column, safety, permanency, and well-being. But if you back up and look at the medium term column, there's some things that don't quite fit. So in this particular case, you can see one of the outcomes that they have in there is continued county and grant funding for facilitators. This particular program relies heavily on people to facilitate meetings, and so they need the funding to continue for that. While that makes sense, it doesn't quite fit in this particular logic model, and I'll show you why in just a minute. The other piece that you can see in the red font, it says capture meaningful outcome data. This was something that when we initially met with the stakeholders, they felt like it was very, very important that this be done. And we put it in the logic model knowing that it will eventually come back out. The logic model will help you capture meaningful data, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that should be in there as an outcome of the program. When I mentioned that the outcome pertaining to county and state grant funding for the facilitators not being a good outcome for that particular draft of the logic model, it wasn't because I didn't like the outcome or that it didn't belong in that medium term column. It's actually because it's a different type of outcome. So what I found when I've been creating logic models is sometimes there are things that we do and outcomes we achieve that are more administrative for the organization versus things that are more programmatic. So you need to look at, am I trying to map out both items, administration and programmatic outcomes, in the same logic model? And if so, I think it's very important that you separate them out. Otherwise, they get too mixed in and you get too many outcomes and it's hard to follow the logic. So one way that you can do that is the example in front of you is maybe just creating some rows or tracks where you have administration in one track and programmatic activities and outcomes in the other track. So for example, in the administration track, your activities might be naming specific kinds of trainings or fundraising activities, or maybe there's certain agency policies that you're going to amend or develop or change that you would put in this column. Then you'd ask yourself, okay, as a result of our training and our fundraising or changes in policies, what are our outcomes? And that might be looking at your staff knowledge. So if you're doing training, you should see a change in knowledge or maybe some skills. If you're doing funding, you might see a change in your procurement of funds or additional funds. And so overall, that might lead to stability and effectiveness of your program. And then you can see that I looped that down to the next column or track, which is the program. And so what I'm trying to indicate there is that it takes all of those administrative activities in order to run the programmatic activities, but they're not intermingled. So looking at that programmatic track, that's the items that you might be more familiar with in the examples that you've looked at. These are mapping out your actual services and then looking at, as a result of those services, what are our short-term, medium-term, and long-term outcomes. So that's just one way that you can handle those differences in outcomes. Again, looking at administrative outcomes versus programmatic outcomes. And if there's a way for you to separate them out, it will make it easier to understand your logic model. So another thing that I wanted to point out about this logic model that I think is a strength of it is the attention to theory. So a lot of times people forget that theory should drive some of our practice, that it gives us an evidence base or a plan of action or a predictive path for mapping our activities to our outcomes. So instead of just relying on our gut instinct, we might rely on theory that tells us if we do certain things, we can expect certain outcomes. So this logic model actually does a nice job of attending to some theoretical supports. So over in the activities, just to highlight one piece of it, you can see it says solution-focused questions. This is actually a therapeutic approach, solution-focused therapy, that has some evidence of effectiveness. And so this is just one example of how they've mapped in an activity that is based on some evidence of effectiveness. On the outcomes columns, you can see some words that are written in blue font. So at the very top in the short-term outcome column, you can see it says receptivity, transparency. Down further, it says investment, and down further from there, it says working relationship. What I love about this logic model is that as we were listening to the stakeholders talk about what they think should be in the logic model, we were putting things down that were in their own words. But then one of my colleagues went back and actually located a theory that supports their plan or their approach. So in this particular logic model, the authors were very interested in focusing on client engagement. They felt that that was one of the critical aspects of their program. And so this theory by Yachmanoff in 2005 is about client engagement, and the author actually identified 4 dimensions of client engagement. So you can see them here: mistrust, receptivity, buy-in, and working relationship. So I'm not going to go into the details about the theory itself, but what we did was we went back then and mapped those dimensions to the items in the logic model that they supported. And it just strengthened the logic model to say, yes, what they're doing here actually links to some of the dimensions that are found to be effective as engagement strategies for clients. And again, that's supported by theory. So that's another piece that I think is really important that this logic model was able to accomplish. Moving on, I wanted to highlight a couple of these outcomes in the medium-term column. You can see that we've used a blue down arrow, and then there's another blue dotted line, and then there's some solid blue lines. This is just, again, breaking out of that traditional model and trying to do as much as we can to use graphics to depict the approach. So while all of these items are in the medium-term outcome column, the stakeholders felt like it was important to break them down a little bit more and to show that some need to be achieved before the others can be achieved. So looking at the first few outcomes in that medium-term column where they say increased sense that something good is going to happen, increased use of family and informal supports, worker and family follow-through, increased family and extended family self-determination. Those items are important to establish in order to then move down further, achieve that family increased buy-in. So that was the purpose for putting that blue down arrow and some of those blue dotted lines. So again, you can use arrows, circles, flowcharts to help communicate the flow of information that best represents the program or the innovative response that you're trying to depict in your own logic model. Then finally, at the very bottom, you can see this particular outcome in the medium-term outcome column, the increased quality of relationship between the family, social worker, and agency. If I had time to go back and strengthen this logic model, I think this is one of the outcomes that I would try to focus on. Whenever we talk about quality of relationship or quality of life, those are sometimes hard to measure, and you have to be very careful that you're not interpreting this outcome through the lens of your own worldview. What my definition of a quality relationship is might be different than other definitions of a quality relationship. Same thing with quality of life. My worldview might give me a different perception of what quality of life is versus somebody else's worldview. So just be careful when you're creating your logic models that you're not putting in outcomes that are so broad that they become hard to measure. Because as you'll find in your program evaluation class later on, you'll go back through these outcomes and say, okay, well, how do we measure these now with evaluation? And finally, another unique thing that this particular logic model did was they split the medium-term outcomes into two columns. And you can see there's a dotted line down the middle trying to indicate permeability between the two columns to show that they flow together. And the only reason for this really was to continue to communicate that process of if-then statements, that even though these are all considered medium-term outcomes, there's still a flow of needing to do one thing before the next thing, and that's that rational model of planning. If we do this, then that will happen. So they just added another column to distinguish that layered approach between what they achieve. And then they finally said, okay, then all of these come together, then help us achieve those long-term goals. And finally, the last thing that I want to point out about this logic model, and again, one of my reasons that I really like this logic model as an example, is that at one point in time, our stakeholders were looking at those child welfare outcomes that I had mentioned earlier of safety, permanency, and well-being. And they said, hold on. And they actually said, wait. I'm not comfortable claiming these outcomes as outcomes we can achieve with our program. This particular program was about an initial meeting with a family after a child had been removed. And it was a meeting to see, if there was anything that could be done to reunify that child as quickly as possible and to resolve the safety concerns that resulted in that removal in the first place. And so the stakeholders said, this is one meeting, maybe two meetings. We can't claim that one meeting with a family is going to result in safety, permanency, and well-being for those kids. What they did want to claim was that engagement. And they said, if we successfully engage the family at that initial meeting, then they'll be able to work more effectively with their social workers and with all the other system supports to then hopefully achieve those longer term outcomes. And so they felt like it was really important that they be clear on exactly what it is they could claim as a result of their program. And I've always respected that about those stakeholders, that they acknowledged that they can't claim that they're saving the world with their one meeting. And I think that's a huge mistake that people often make when they create logic models, is that they claim too much with a very small program. If you're doing an 8-module parenting class, can you really claim that children are going to be healthy throughout the rest of their life as a result of that 8-module parenting class? So you would back up and say, okay, what can I claim? So in this case, again, they backed up and they said, engagement is what we can claim. We can claim that we engage those families and then they're able to work more effectively. And so you can see that middle box. I think this is one of my favorite things about this particular logic model. You can see in red font it says, integration with other child welfare services to implement, monitor, and reinforce the safety plan. So that's that acknowledgement. Other programs and services need to step in at this point in time and integrate with what they were able to start in order to then achieve those final child welfare outcomes of safety, permanency, and well-being. So don't be afraid to add that language in there about integration with other services, and then you can still show how your program is important in achieving those long-term outcomes without falsely making claims that it will be your program alone that will achieve those outcomes. So that's a really important feature to pay attention to and to try and figure out how you can communicate that in your own logic models as well. So finally, I want to go back to those 3 questions that I started this presentation out with. Overall, was it easier or harder than you thought? So again, we probably all agree that it starts out easy, but it's also easy to get confused. This is a very natural part of the process, and you just need to know that going in. This is why it's really important to do a draft, walk away, and then come back and try it again. And for that reason, going on to that second question, was it a little tedious? Logic models are tedious, and to say that they're not would be lying. So it's a long and iterative process. If you do it right, it will be a long and iterative process. I can go and create a logic model some evening in my office and then hand it to people, but it's not going to be useful for anybody because it didn't go through that drafting process. It didn't go through that critical thinking process of going through your logical flow of activities to outcomes. So again, just remember your first draft is never good. And finally, handling those nuanced differences. Some of you probably at some point in time just started clicking to get through the activity, just clicking to see where those items go. That's okay. That's actually this notion of keep trying. If something doesn't fit, if you put it down on the logic model and it just doesn't seem right, keep trying, move it around, see, is this better as an activity or is this better as a short-term outcome? And then you might say, oh, whoops, it's actually a medium-term outcome. So that notion of moving things around or clicking until you get it right is actually a way that you can get through creating logic models too. Just put it down, see if it fits, and if not, move it, try something different. And then finally, using those if-then statements is probably your most powerful tool in the editing process of your logic model. Really go through and say, if I do 8 modules of a parenting class with parents, what knowledge will they get? What skills will they get? What awareness will they achieve? And if they gain that knowledge, what behaviors will result from that knowledge? Or if they gain those skills, then what behaviors will we see? So using if-then statements to check your logic is probably the best way that you can handle getting confused within those nuanced differences. So I hope you enjoyed the activity. Again, logic models are a long and an iterative process, but when used appropriately, they're extremely effective in practice. Thank you.